You can hear me okay. We're gonna get the session going. Various people still coming in. There's a session on PPPs, I'm told, going on next door. I guess that's the competition this afternoon. Aviation's Quest for Financial Sustainability is the title of this session. We're going to run for about an hour and a half. I'll kick us off. We'll have an hour-long discussion up on the stage with the panelists, and then I do want to open it to you, the audience, for some Q&A. Let me give you a few brief words to set the scene. As it says in the briefing documents, this is an industry that we all know has struggled in recent years in spite of the dynamism and economic importance of the sector. Challenges abound, in particular the need to find new sources of infrastructure financing, especially with respect to airports and air navigation systems. Now, one of our panelists is Mike Trethewey. His paper, Airports and Airlines in the Value Chain, sheds a fascinating light on some of the challenges this industry faces, in particular the often strained relationship between the airports and the airlines. That's certainly something we will talk about this afternoon. When you look at the stats in Mike's paper, it seems the airlines in particular, and you tell me if I've got this wrong, but it seems the airlines in particular have a pretty raw deal. Razor-thin profit margins, indeed the lowest return along the value chain, despite the value chain for commercial air transport services, despite being arguably the most important member of that value chain. He quotes, in fact, in that paper, an Economist article from last year, which he argues summarizes the problem for airlines well. Airlines make profits for everyone along the aviation value chain, except for themselves. That said, it isn't plain sailing for the airports either. We'll hear from that side too today. While able to achieve somewhat better financial returns, they are collectively barely covering their cost of capital. So with that as a broad backdrop, I wanted to split this discussion into three parts. First, we're going to take a general look at the financial stability of the sector as a whole. Second, an examination of the relationship which I've already touched on, between the airports and the airlines. What can and should governments do in normal times and in times of crisis? And third, and finally, a discussion of airport finance, how to coordinate funding of new airports and how to get private capital into airport investment. So plenty to talk about, plenty for us to throw around. It's quite a cosy setting this afternoon. If you've got any burning questions that you want to ask during the session, because it's quite a small group here, put your hand up and I'll bring you into the discussion. Let me introduce the panel. Cahal Guillaumard, Commissioner with Ireland's Commission for Aviation Regulation at the end here. Next to him is Sani Sener, CEO of TAV Airports in Turkey. Mike Trethewey, Executive Vice President, Intervistas Canada. And at the end is Katsuhiro Yamaguchi from the new Kansai International Airport Company in Japan. So a great mix on the panel today. Let me start, Mike, with you, with a general question, and one you have touched on in the paper and other papers. Is the airline, the airport, let's talk about this as a whole to start with. The business, the aviation business, inherently financial, unstable, and what, if anything, can be done about that soon?
Well, my paper focuses on the whole aviation value chain, looking at all the different participants, and using a study by McKinsey, we actually document the rate of return that the various value chain partners earn relative to their cost of capital. So there's a few elements of the value chain that are extremely profitable. It turns out that the GDSs, or computer reservation systems, travel agents and freight forwarders actually make extraordinary profits in most years. It's actually a pretty consistent outcome that they're getting. The airports, air navigation, are close to covering their cost of capital. They're not quite there, but they're certainly more financially stable than the airlines are. As you indicated, the paper finds that the airline returns are are marginal. Globally, they're less than their cost of capital. There are some airlines who actually do fairly well, and actually if you correct some of these numbers and actually look at a return on equity, it's always a mystery. Why do people continue to invest in the airlines if the returns are so lousy? But actually on a return on equity basis, it's not quite so bad, but it's very volatile. The gap between survival of the airlines and failure is actually relatively small. To kind of put a number around it, if you could get $10, those are 10 real dollars, Canadian dollars. So what would that be? 6 pounds or 7 euros, something like that. If you could get that much more per ticket,
you have to ask our new Canadian Bank of England chief.
Yes, yeah. Strength in both countries, we think, actually. That's another comment. But the gap between survival and I wouldn't say prosperity, but is relatively small. One of the things I focus on in the paper is the opportunity to rethink the value chain, and are there ways that we could change policy, for example, to allow the airline sector to achieve better returns. And in a separate paper, I actually addressed the issue of GDSs. I think there are some government structural barriers there that are allowing the GDSs to earn very high profits. They were deregulated back in the early 2000s, and that was likely a mistake. And as a result, for example, when U.S. Airways and American Airlines attempted to change incentives in the value chain to use alternative distribution methods, the two U.S. GDSs, Travelport and Sabre, actually then moved their flights down to the very bottom of the screens, and so the travel agents stopped booking on them. And I think government policy could address that. And I also have some suggestions on the airport side as well. The main one there is that the way most governments, as well as the contractual relationship between airports and airlines, the way that works is that it either allows or actually requires the airports to break even every year. And yet the paper shows that airports are actually relatively low risk relative to airlines. There's certainly risk in the airport sector, but relative to the airlines, the risk is a lot lower. And what happens is when recessions come, airports, particularly those that are required to break even every year, deal with the fall off in their revenues then by increasing fees. So essentially the airports have largely fixed costs, and they maintain their revenue by raising fees at exactly the time where it's the worst to do that for airports. So one of my suggestions is that perhaps a change in institutions, whether contractual or regulatory, to allow airports to bear some risk through the business cycle, where maybe they would be allowed to run less than full cost recovery in some years, but then they would be allowed to achieve more than cost recovery in other years, sort of over the whole business cycle, that they would achieve a rate of return.
And we'll come on. We'll delve into that in a little bit more detail in a second. But very quickly on the back of that, is there, as far as you're concerned, is there a light at the end of the tunnel for the airlines?
I do think so. Again, in a separate paper.
You do think so?
Yes. And the key I actually see there is the development of ancillary revenue sources. So in the United States, for example, ancillary revenues, that's charging for baggage fees and so forth, that generated $6 billion in profits for the airlines. The total profits for the airlines last year were $6 billion. And a term we use in economics is we talk about the airline industry as having an empty core. Now, that's kind of a strange term, but what it means is competition is so intense in the airline sector that essentially they will always compete the price down to what we call marginal cost, or the variable cost of flights, leaving their fixed costs uncovered. So the airlines have to find a new source of revenue to cover their fixed costs, and that means they have to find something of value that some consumers at least are willing to pay above cost for that. And these ancillary services may be the means by which that can be done.
All right. Carl, let me come to you. Are airlines and airports in as, and I guess I'm talking more about the airlines now, but in as dire financial straits as we think they are?
Well, certainly judging by the information in Mike's paper, and I think the information you read about elsewhere, it's maybe one of the few industries where collectively over half a century the returns have been rock bottom. Now, it's clear that within that total there are some well-known airlines that are extremely profitable, but then obviously there are others that are losing a lot of money as well.
What is your general sense to the overarching question, inherent financial instability in this sector? What is your feeling on that front?
Well, something has to change, clearly, and there are already. I mean, there's a fairly steady process actually of restructuring, I think, amongst airlines, and likely to be more. And once some of that has happened, presumably the position will be different then.
Sani, let's get your opening remarks, general remarks on the sector, and then we can go a little bit deeper into the airport side.
Actually, today I can give the practical example of our company, Kansai Airports and Turkish Airlines, what we have done. Yes, we all know that airline operation and airport operators are competitive businesses, but at the same time they are complementaries of each other. So there is only one way to solve this conflict. It is constructive negotiations, and we call it co-opetition. First cooperate and enlarge the cake, and then we can compete. And this is exactly what we have done in Turkey. In 2000, there was a tender for Istanbul Atatürk Airport. It was a PPP, BOT type tender. We won the tender and established this company, Kansai Airports company. We built it in a record time in 22 months. And then Turkish Airlines, we sat down with Turkish Airlines. Our minister is here, but not in this hall. I think he will come in a minute. Our minister is the Minister of Transport nearly for 12 years. So there is a consistency. There is a consistent policy. He liberalized, this government, single-party government, liberalized the airlines. There was competition in the airlines, but at the same time, they put in the PPP method for creating new infrastructures, making an infrastructure asset like airports. They are visible. I mean, to privatize that airports are difficult, actually. You have to change the public mindset. You have to change the legal infrastructure. And then you have to dismantle the government intervention. So when you look at the airlines, it is acting on commercial basis, but airports were acting as government-managed government enterprises. So there was a conflict, and airlines actually were exploiting the airports. But now, airports are not just infrastructure providers, they are commercial businesses. So they are facing commercial disciplines. So airlines are facing commercial disciplines. So it is much easier for us to cooperate with airlines. I mean, every week, 2 or 3 times, I met with the CEO and chairman of Turkish Airlines. What we can do. We call, as you know, CDM, collaborative decision making. This is actually a data facility for the punctuality in airports. But actually, it's not only for punctuality. We are transferring information continuously. Continuous information transfer and continuous quick decision really give this result in Turkish aviation sector. What's happened? Now in Turkey, there are 7 brand new airports, all constructed and now operated under the scheme of PPP. And there is a Turkish Airlines, which is one of the largest airlines in Europe. And second, we have low-cost carriers like Pegasus. They are doing very well. Pegasus ordered 100 planes. Turkish Airlines, when we entered the business, the fleet of Turkish Airlines was consisting of 62 aircrafts. Now they have 215 aircrafts. They were flying only 4 destinations in Africa. They are flying now 34 destinations in Africa. And the location of Istanbul is helping them a lot. And between 1990 and 2000, there was coalition governments in Turkey. So they couldn't cope with the requirements of the globalization. But after 2000, with the single-party government, it was easy for Turkey to invest in infrastructure on PPP basis and liberalize the airlines, and then we got the result. Now, when in 2000, it was our first year in operation, we had 10 million passengers in Istanbul Atatürk Airport. Now we have 45 million passengers in Istanbul Atatürk Airport. It is the fastest growing airport in the world. We have done this together with Turkish Airlines. I mean, if we were after only our revenues, which is actually their cost, okay, so they would lose a lot of money and they wouldn't like to grow. Now we really encourage them to grow. So the result is there. There's a practical success there. The cooperation with airlines and airports is the important part. But with my airport hat, I am telling to them that in the world, I mean, I think 15% of the cost of airlines is given to the airports. So it's not too much. Actually, they have to run after their other costs like staff cost and oil cost, which is the main costs. So airports and airlines are competitors and complementaries at the same time, but in Turkey we made it happen.
Okay, many thanks. Some very interesting points then. Mr. Yamaguchi, I want to pick up on that cooperation, and it's something I want to talk more about in a sec with all of you, the constructive negotiation, as Sally called it. And the consistency in terms of the government minister. What is your experience in Japan, and should we hold Turkey up as an example of how this should work?
Okay. I think I'd start off with sharing some of the recent experiences in Kansai. We operate 2 airports now. One is international airport, but 40 kilometers south of the city center. Mm-hmm. And the older one is only 10 kilometers from the center, called Itami. But there was a difficult noise issue there. So what happened was that in 1994 we built the new airport, which is far away, off the coast, 5 kilometers off the coast. We reclaimed the island, which costed a lot in capital. Mm-hmm. But at that stage, they were separate entities. I'll come back to that. And at Kansai International Airport, we started to think about the cooperation with the airlines, particularly until last year, we didn't have a Japan-based LCC with the last comers, the last. So back in 2009, we were discussing with the Japanese airlines to sort of start up a new breed of airlines at Kansai International Airport. And our proposal was to build a dedicated LCC terminal, and also to discount the landing charges for the new flights and additional flights, so that they can, when they grow, they can have lower costs in terms of landing charges. So with that, Peach Aviation, which is a third subsidiary of ANA, but has a significant other equity investments in it, started up in March. And within a year, they managed to cover more than 1 million passengers, which mostly dedicated to the 17% growth in our airport in terms of flights. So the first target was the LCC. And the second one we tackled was the air cargo market, the express air cargo market. And now we are building a specific warehouse terminal for Federal Express for their Asian Pacific hub to be located and start next spring. So we were sort of working together with a specific new breed of segments to be established in Kansai. But that sort of triggered tension between other existing airlines. So we are trying to balance that by providing them other types of discounts in landing charges and fees and so on to balance. So our challenge is to have a collaborative relationship, everybody. But of course, there's always, some tensions behind that. That's the growth strategy part of our recent experience. And the second one is related to the two airports I mentioned. Before integration of the two airports in July last year, they were separate. So what happened was that the Kansai Airport side was always saying Itami should be restricted or, abolished, abandoned. But the problem with this Itami Airport is that if the airport is closed down, majority of the passengers would probably go to the Shinkansen, the bullet train, instead of coming to, the Kansai International Airport. So the idea was to pool the resources and the cash flows in a single entity. And that happened last year. So now we have started to utilize Itami by converting, there's a very strict slot regulations. There's only 370 takeoffs and landings allowed per day, and out of which 200 is limited to 200 is for the jet planes. So the others are limited to the props. Now, we were saying that recently, the new generation aircrafts are very quiet and even more quieter than the props. So we converted, step by step, the 170 slots into a low noise aircraft slot so that can be utilized by the turbojets. So that allowed us to integrate or internalize the activities at the airport. That's the second issue. And by doing so, we have a new cash flow. And we have been dependent on subsidy from the government in terms of the Kansai International Airport because of the huge debt since 2003. By combining, now we were sort of sunsetting the subsidy so that eventually it will be zero. And at that point, the third point is that we would be selling the operational rights of the two airports to international investors and trying to slice off majority of the, if not all, of the 10 billion US dollars worth of outstanding bonds, to slice off the debt. So that's the impact for our airport. But in fact, this type of so-called brownfield PPPs is the first in Japan to be put through. Currently, there's a law that tries to allow other 27 national airlines to be dealt in the same way, fully privatized through specific duration of selling operation rights. So in a way, this Kansai Airport model is trying to push through a new type of PPP in Japan, which is very slow. Basically, the PFIs in Japan were only public buildings until now. There's not much of the transportation infrastructure that has been dealt that way. So hopefully we will open a new window of opportunities for the PPPs in Japan.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And funding is something I do want to come back to as well. But I want to stick, Mike, with the relationship. We've heard from Sani about constructive negotiations. I just said CDM. We've just heard as well about in Japan, in Kansai, collaborative relationships. Okay, albeit with tensions. Is it easy to overplay the tensions between airports and airlines?
No, I think they're genuine in some cases. There's a few areas that are really trigger spots between airlines and airports.
Let's take a look at those.
Yes. So one is an airport that starts to offer incentives to an airline they're attempting to attract, and the incumbent airlines often are very unhappy with that. And so if you put in incentive programs, you have to have a very effective communication problems with your incumbent airlines. One is you have to make clear to them that the incumbents, are not going to pay the fees that you're forgiving from the other one. And some airports they've tried to have a closed loop so that we'll give Southwest Airlines an incentive, but United Airlines will pay higher fees. You can't do that. You have to make sure that the books are transparent, that this is something we'll take out of our commercial revenues or something like that. And you have to make sure that the incentives are available for them. Another is that when the airport makes a capital decision of $10 billion, whatever the amount might be, the incumbent airlines are often worried that they're going to end up paying for this. And so it's very important that you have an effective and meaningful consultation with them and a set of rules around what the rates they're going to pay. And actually I think what Cahal did as regulator of Dublin Airport was actually very clever, where the airport wanted to make a major investment. And it may have been an overinvestment, and maybe Cahal would want to comment on that.
Yeah, let's hear from you, Cahal. In terms of, well, specifically to the point Mike's making, but also what else governments can and should do.
Yeah, well, on the question of risk and who bears the risk on the part of airport investment, clearly, if an airport wishes to build a large terminal or a runway or something of that nature, under a single-till price regulatory system, if the traffic forecast that accompanies that investment plan proves to be too optimistic, the airport, of course, will want to compensate by raising charges more than they would have done in any event later on. And in a sense, then, the airlines and the passengers are providing insurance for this project to the airport. Now, however, there are innovations, I think, which can help to deal with that particular problem. Certainly in the case of Dublin Airport, the situation I've described to you is exactly what prevailed. And we have crafted a regulatory decision now where the recovery of the cost of the new terminal, or the recovery of a portion of this cost, is conditional on the traffic at the airport reaching the level that the airport had forecast. So we were satisfied to allow the terminal to be put into the regulatory calculation on that basis. If it's too optimistic, well then some of the cost will be borne by the airport. A portion of the cost, reflecting the fact that the airlines are using the new terminal, will of course be borne by the users of that terminal. So for a well-defined project with a formal regulatory system, there's some scope to decide where you're going to assign risk, as long, of course, as all the parties are prepared to go along with that, and in particular that the airport is prepared to build the building on that basis. I think when you come to general airport operations, I mean, Mike's paper discusses what you might call countercyclical aeronautical charges, so that there would be a discount in a recession and higher charges in a boom. I think there, if such a system were to be introduced now, in recessionary times, effectively airports would lose revenues compared to what would otherwise be the case in return for compensation at some point in the future. If you were to introduce that system in a boom, it's the reverse. But in either case, somebody is losing in the short term for the sake of compensation later on. And I think you'd find it hard to introduce that unless you had a rather formal agreement to reassure whoever is making the sacrifice now that the compensation will actually appear in due course.
So, okay, so hard to implement. Is there an answer, though, to that problem? The counter-cyclical charges?
Well,
what is the answer to that?
Well, I think if you're setting a price cap for an extended period of time, obviously you then wouldn't normally require the airport to achieve its profit target year by year. So you would expect over a longish cycle that it would cover its cost of capital and so on. So I think relatively long price caps would be more compatible with what you're talking about there. Where you don't have a formal system, I think really you're talking about some kind of contractual arrangements between airlines and the airport.
I mean, can you imagine a formal system coming into play? Sorry, Sandy will come.
Yes, in fact, we also do work in the regulation and operations of ferries. And so in Canada, one of our ferry regulators, we're regulated provincially, has what's called a fuel price adjustment mechanism. You actually see this in electric utilities quite a bit. So the idea is that you establish a rate for fuel, and the toll or the charge for the year is based on that. If fuel price goes up, you essentially create a bank where the uncompensated higher fuel cost gets banked, and then when fuel prices come down, presumably, the ferry rate will actually stay high until they're covered. So you can actually do this. Now, if fuel prices simply stay up, as we kind of saw, to some extent over the last 10 years, it will eventually get folded into the rates. But it's a mechanism by which you can get past a 4 or 5 year regulatory cycle by banking the under-recovery of costs by the airport, that eventually they will be able to recover that either when times are good or alternatively by readjusting the rate base.
So that's the theory, right? Well, no, it's actually happening, you say.
Well, it's been in use in the electric power sector for 30 years in a number of continents, and it's relatively new in the transport sector, but it works.
Can you see this happening in the transport sector, Sonny?
Sorry?
Can you see something like that happening in the transport sector?
Yes, I see. Now, 2 years back, I was in a panel like this, and I was representing airports, and a senior executive from EasyJet was one of the panelists. I was telling that, today's passengers are much more sophisticated. They want easy access to airports. They want smooth check-in areas. They want fewer lines to stand, and then no queues in passport, lounges, nice, comfortable waiting areas. He jumped in and he said, no, we are asking a runway and a tent. Now, this is actually the solution of the problem. So, as you said, there is an equation in these kind of investments, in these kind of financing. CapEx must be equal, this is the break-even point, must be equal to revenue minus OPEX minus interest amount. 30% of the CapEx comes from equity, 70% comes from project financial institutions. So this is the formula. If CapEx is 1 billion euros, then you need huge revenue. And revenue comes from aeronautical revenues and non-aeronautical revenues. Aeronautical revenues are mainly regulated revenues, landing fees, passenger boarding fees, and check-in fees, that's all, not more. So these are regulated. So before these kind of PPP tenders or investments, airlines and airports has to sit together. If they are asking a tent, and a runway, then it's easy. But actually, they are not asking a tent and a runway, because otherwise passengers will not use your airport, will select the other airport and move to the other airport. So it is actually a complex system. So we have to manage this complexity. It is the volume business and complex business. So we have to manage this complexity. Otherwise, as I told before, their expenditure is my revenue. I want to increase my revenue. They want to reduce their expenditure. So there is a huge conflict. And the other conflict is they are saying that passenger is our passenger. We are saying that no, it is our passengers. Okay. Actually, we are partners with airlines. Passengers are our customers. This is the mentality that we are trying to do in our airports. But are we successful? I mean, results are good. We are successful. But, for example, it's not only Istanbul Airport. We are in Medina. The incumbent airline is Saudi Airlines. In there, we are working with them. In Tunisia, we are working Tunisia Airlines. In Baltics, we are working with Air Baltic. So the relation between the airlines and airports are very important. Our minister came.
Your minister as
Mr.
well.
Minister, we were talking about you.
Welcome.
I was telling that he is the minister for 12 years, and the consistency in the policies really created huge infrastructures in Turkey, and the growth of Turkish Airlines came parallel to it. So really we thank to him a lot. And you were saying the same thing. The policy consistency is very important. As I told you before, between 1990 and 2000, the quick decisions couldn't be given by the coalition governments. After the single-party governance, then it was easy, and a third-term ministerialship is very important because the liberalization in the air up there and privatization in the ground helped these two complementary and competitor sectors to achieve these goals.
Yeah. Yeah, come on in.
Cost-based perspective, very strong perspective by the airlines, have affected how the government deals with airports. Traditionally, airports were seen as cost centers, but we realized that there's a incentive issue related. So we came up with the price cap, CPI minus X type of regulation, for instance. But then you're faced with this year-by-year break-even type of framework that needs to be more flexible because of the recessions and the booms. So one of the probably the new ideas is to have a more light-handed type of regulation and monitor for a number of years what's going on and how the airlines are dealing with their business, so that the government can respond depending on what the economic environment is. Mm-hmm. So if the economy is in a normal trend, they would look into the airport management in a more natural way, in a sense. But when the crisis comes, they have to step in, perhaps, to in some cases bail out not only the airlines but the airports. But before that happens, I guess one of the ideas is to enable airlines to have some sort of a cushion, as Mike has mentioned, as a sort of fund, so that when something happens, they can absorb some of the shocks for a meantime, and then, depending on the size of the impact, the government might want to do something else in addition. So in that way, the airlines would have a softer cushion in a sense, but the reality perhaps is that you don't want any cushion. We just want the hard land to land the aircraft.
Yeah. Come on in quickly, and then Mike will come to you.
Concerning crisis. It's okay. Yeah. Concerning crisis. Now, as I told you before, we have started this business in 2000. I mean, in 1999 there was a devastating earthquake in Turkey. The impact was in 2000. In 2001 there was the Turkish local economical crisis. A large amount of banks were bankrupt, and then 9/11. And then Afghanistan war, Iraq war, which is all around Turkey, happened. These were external shocks, avian flu, and then SARS disease, ash cloud, and we are operating Tunisia. The Arab Spring started in Tunisia. So we had a lot of external shocks during the operation in 12 years. What happened? I mean, we have seen that the shocks plunged the passenger numbers a lot, but the recovery is always very quick. It's a V-type crisis we had it. Always quick. So external shocks will happen, definitely happen, but the growth will continue. I'm very sure on this. Because there is a correlation between the GDPs of the countries and the increase in passenger number. It is 1.5 to 2 in the developed markets, but in Turkey it's too much. I mean, last year in Istanbul Atatürk Airport, we achieved 24% year-on-year basis increase in passenger number, but the GDP of Turkey was 2.2%. So in Turkey, the aviation is not related to GDP of the country. It's growing.
And what are the forecasts for this year for Atatürk?
20%.
20 to 20.
Yeah.
And the GDP forecast?
GDP forecast about 4%.
Okay.
So again,
so that comes down and GDP goes up.
Goes up.
Okay, Mike, you wanted to come in on.
Yes. With the airline-airport relationship, we often find that you have a different dialogue with different people in the airline. So many airlines are organized where they have a vice president responsible for airport properties, and their incentive is to keep airport costs down as low as possible. We've often found, however, that if you have a dialogue at the most senior level of the airline, their attitude toward the airport is very different. So in Canada, for example, Toronto Airport was extremely congested. It desperately needed at least 2 more runways. And at first, the airline was saying, no, we don't want to pay for that. It's just going to benefit our competitors. But at the more senior level, they began to realize that their operations as an airline, when bad weather comes in, for example, and the congestion is, aircraft are waiting an hour and a half, and passengers are interrupted. Now you're putting them up in hotels, and you have to pay taxi cabs to take their bags to their home and so forth. An effective airport operation by investing in capacity can actually reduce the airline's operating costs, in the case of Air Canada, by about $350 million per year. In a case of Turkish Airlines, given how fast it's growing, it'll likely decrease its cost by $500 million, $750 million per year by making that investment. And it's important for the airport and the airlines to have the dialogue at the most senior level, where the senior airline manager will understand the real value of this, even though they know their costs will go up in some ways, but then they can see the trade-off that my missed connection costs of passengers, baggage, failure costs, and so forth will decline dramatically and offset that.
And it seems that dialogue at that level is happening in Turkey. In Japan? Is that dialogue happening at that level in Japan? Yeah. Okay. I want to move it on. I'm very wary of the time here, but I want to move it on and gain a little bit more insight, especially from the airport operators, into funding, private versus purely public versus PPP, and just give us your insights into that and what you think is most favourable, and perhaps we can contrast the Japanese and Turkish stances.
Commented it initially. Not much has been happening in Japan in terms of PFI, PPP in transport infrastructures up till now. Probably the mentality of the government and related industry is similar to Germany, where the transportation infrastructure should be funded by the public sector. There's some kind of a strong mentality. Mm-hmm. But as the economy grows and now we are picking off in population and aging, we no longer think that building new airports, for instance, is the top priority. It's more handling existing infrastructures more better, in a sense. So the issue is shifting towards maintenance and replacing the infrastructure. And when we look at that phase, there's more opportunity for the private sector to do better jobs, making efficient maintenance, for instance. They can do better. And perhaps life cycle cost management might be their another area of their competence. And so we try to incubate these type of private sector knowledge and combine that with the investors. But it's sort of a chicken and the egg. We don't have the projects, PFI, PPP projects. So I guess the two airport privatization through concession would be a lead to that sort of a market generating at last in Japan. Perhaps UK, Australia has been in the lead. We're sort of following that and trying to enter the circle, in a sense.
Sunny.
Now, in airport financing and building infrastructures, as I told you before, airport operation is not only an infrastructure provider, it is a commercial business. I fully agree that it is a commercial business. So in commercial businesses, you need to enhance your revenue, you have to control your cost, OPEX. So financing is made accordingly. The CAPEX must be equal to revenue minus OPEX minus interest amount. That's it. This is the formula. The equity is now the important part. Before 2008, to find equity wasn't so important because banks would finance 100% of your project. But now the minimum is 30%, then it can go up to 50%. So the equity must be on the table in day one. Because especially European banks, there's a lot of money in the world now, a lot of money. But the money is constrained to come to emerging markets, especially Basel III criteria, the ratio and equity. The capital of the banks is very important. Because of this ratio, they cannot give long-term financing. But Turkish banks now are very powerful, and there is liquidity. So in Turkey, in financing the infrastructure projects, we do not have the difficulty to finance the projects. So Turkey is a good example for PPPs. I know that in Japan there is no much PPP, but in Turkey we had 7 airports built and now operating under PPP method. So privatization in the ground and liberalization in the air really make the system work. So I'm sure that the growth in the infrastructure through commercializing airports will definitely continue in emerging markets. In Saudi, it was very easy in Medina. Even we did not put $1 equity because it's a cash-rich country. The banks are very rich, so they give EBL, equity bridge loans. Okay, we are going to pay the equity back-ended. So this is another case. But in Macedonia, I mean, they ask 40% equity from the banks. So the local conditions are very important in financing and funding infrastructure projects. And the legal infrastructure of the country is very important. As I said, the consistency is very important. In Turkey, you have the legal infrastructure. So this is, for example, last year, TAV Airports Holdings sold 38% of their shares to Airport de Paris. And why we have sold to them, it's another kind of financing the projects. First of all, Airport de Paris is operating 25 airports in the world. We are operating 12 airports, so you control 37 airports data. I mean, data mining is the important part in our business because we need the data of the passengers, so we have to predict the passenger behavior to increase our commercial revenues. And as you said, commercial revenues is very important in our business because aeronautical revenues are regulated. It is visible. To finance airports, I mean, you give them, the banks, because our earnings are visible. They can easily calculate what you can earn. So there is no surprises in airport business. There will be some crisis, okay? But as I said, the recovery will be much easier. I don't see any problem in the future for financing infrastructure projects. In the main panel, the editor, chief editor in Economist, he was saying that about United States of America. I fully agree with him that United States of America made a big mistake in bailing out directly to the banks and not going to infrastructure. For example, in Turkey, during the crisis time, Turkish government opened the way much more for privatization of infrastructure assets. So bridges, roads, airports, created a lot of infrastructure assets which are operated by private companies, and this sparked the market growth, and this sparked the product and capital markets growth in Turkey.
Yeah, please, Mike. Yeah.
I wanted to add one comment on equity because I think it was
and you touch on this in your paper as well.
Indeed, I think a very important point is how you could finance an airport 12 years ago is different today. Today, equity is important. But it's also important to have liquidity for the equity. And one of the things I comment in my paper is we have seen a secondary market emerge so that the initial investors in an airport property or enterprise can actually get out of that and sell it. And a good example actually was just a few weeks ago here in Germany. Hochtief actually sold a portion of their airport equity portfolio to the Canada pension plan. So I'm actually quite happy about that because airports, I think, are low risk in a lot of ways. But we've also seen a number of other secondary transactions. Macquarie's Commissioner Davies actually talked about the Australians financing a lot in airports. And Macquarie's has been active both in selling initial investments and then buying other investments. And I think that's a very important development of the last 5 or so years is the emergence of a secondary equity market to provide equity investors liquidity, which then makes it much easier to engage in continuing PPP in peer private financing for airports.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, Hochtief sold, to Canadian fund, and they were partners actually before. There is a lot of secondary market. Why? Because airport business or airline business is not a solo business. It is a consolidated business. When you look at TAV Airports, we have ground handling company, we have partners with Turkish Airlines, we are partners with Air Baltic, we have 12 airport companies, we have duty-free companies. So we are managing a network. Through the network, through economies of scale, and through economies of scope, it is very easy for you to reduce the cost and increase the revenue. Yes. So the banks like this.
Okay, good. Do you want to say something on the equity side before I open it up to some questions from our audience?
Yeah, in addition to the 2 airports that we actually operate, we're also looking at other possibility of other airports, both in Japan and also in Southeast Asia, for instance. Currently, we're starting to participate in bids and thinking how, as you said, how we could capitalize on what we already know how to do in other airports. Yeah. But still, when we look at emerging economies, they tend to overestimate the power of PFIs. That's my personal feeling. There are lots of risks involved, national risks, other business risks that is difficult to foresee. So there needs to be some sort of a participation by the local government. So ideally, there will be some sort of a negotiation when the actual project goes through. So probably won't be what it's set out in the initial stages, but still, there's some sort of a tendency to rely too much on the PFI. That's my impression.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a very quick hour, but I do want to throw it over to the audience now, and please feel free to ask questions on any of those areas and any new areas. Yeah, gentleman right here in the middle. If you just wait for the microphone and then tell us who you are before you ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Enno Ozinga from Amsterdam Airport Schiphol, so very much involved in these debates. And few observations linked with a comment. Clearly, there is a continuous discussion between airports and airlines, which I think is also driven by the fact that they work on a different time horizon. When an airport is developing master plan, we're talking 15, 20 years ahead. Airlines, in the current survival mode, are talking a few years ahead, and in fact, the low-cost airlines are talking less than a year ahead, and quite frankly, they'll switch to another airport without a doubt. So it's a complexity to match the long-term debate with the short-term debate. Secondly, because you have to invest in the future, and assuming that you're working on the long-term growth, it means you have to invest now for something that is not actually going to benefit the airline, let's say, until in 10 years' time. In fact, in most cases, the airline will not pay for it in 10 years' time. In fact, in some cases, you may even worry whether that airline still exists. And particular example in JFK, where we were involved, and Mike, your company was involved, you build a terminal for a specific airline. What happens if that airline goes bankrupt? The airport then says it doesn't matter. The marketplace is there. If this airline doesn't fly, somebody else will fly. But of course, for the airline, that is not an argument. So there's a conflict there. But because you have to invest in the long term, the best time to build for an airport is actually during an economic downturn. Now, if you lower your rates during the economic downturn, you actually go in a loss-making situation during the economic downturn. But then you have to go to the financial market and say, I now need to raise a few billion euros or dollars or whatever to invest. Your actual costs are going to go up. So, I recognized what you're saying, and in fact, we have, especially on the cargo side, we've lowered the cost significantly over the last years to help the handlers survive. But as a fundamental investment point, I do believe, Mike, that the point you're saying, lower your cost at a downturn, that's a short-term option, but at the long term, you're actually going to pay the price for that. But maybe you have a different view on that, or especially with Turkey, who is very much in a situation like Amsterdam, being a transit airport, and may look at it differently.
Well, we are partners. We are partners with Schiphol. Oh. I mean, they are partners of Aéroport de Paris. That's why we are partners with them. I fully agree what you are saying. That is why I'm saying that there's an equation. Actually, it's not a magical equation. I mean, airlines and airports has to sit together and decide. Like EasyJet senior executive told me, he said that we are after a runway and a tent. It's EasyJet's position. But we are not after a tent and a runway. We are after sophisticated passengers because, I mean, the 20% and 80% rule, as in other businesses, applies to airports. I mean, we are gaining 80% of our revenue from the 20% of our passengers. So I agree that for the financing, we have to understand the future predictions of the airlines, what they are going to do. So the time interval for it is very important.
And Mike, to this point that it is not, if I've got this right, it is not actually cost effective for the airport to lower their costs in a downturn, right? Yes. Was the point, I think.
Yes, so I should differentiate my comments about allowing an airport to run a modest deficit in a recession wasn't meant to include the capital program. If capital investment's required, the rates have to go up for that. The idea is that a number of our clients, we've seen that there's an actual requirement that they have to break even every single year. And so the result is, barring a capital program, that they don't actually have the ability to hold back their charges. If they do, they can never recover it because the regulatory regime or the contractual relationship with the airline will never allow them to recover this year's deficit. Let's say you run a 5% deficit on your revenues. You can't recover it next year or 2 years later. But when it comes to capital program, I wasn't suggesting that the idea would be that you'd run billion-dollar deficits for that. That still has to be covered by the airlines.
Okay, yep, please.
Two examples of dedicated terminal funding in Kansai International Airport. The idea is to have a commitment. It's a sort of a bilateral commitment to utilize this facility as a base or a hub. Otherwise, we won't go into a long-term investment. If they are saying that, well, we're footloose, I don't think we should invest. Unless we have a sort of long-term commitment, at least 10 years, for instance, we can't convince the ministry, for instance, before we go to the financial institutions. So in our case, it's always a search for a new breed of base airlines to be established in our airport. That was our mission.
Thank you very much. Yeah, question at the front here.
Hello, I'm Bart Jansen from USA Today, a newspaper. I had a question more about government regulation, so perhaps for Ireland. Something that we hear from the airlines about their tough profitability is having to pay things that they find troublesome. So one dispute is the EU has this emissions trading scheme. There's a dispute about whether that's unfair to charge folks outside of Europe for those fees, and now there are negotiations for perhaps a global resolution. And I wondered, what do you think are the likelihood of a global resolution? There's also Europe has a fairly generous reimbursement policy when flights are canceled. Other countries, such as the United States, don't have hardly anything. And so, again, airlines would like to have a more global policy because they have a hard time pricing a ticket. If it's going to get delayed one place or the other, how much do they have to pay? So I wondered, in both of those cases, what do you think are the prospects for a global solution?
Okay, well, I'll take the second of those first because I know a little bit more about that. The European Union regulation, which provides for certain entitlements of passengers when flights are cancelled and delayed and so on, is in the course of being revised at the moment. I think primarily because the volcanic ash episode had entirely unintended effects on airlines. So the scope will be somewhat more modest, particularly in those particular catastrophic situations. But it will still be true that that there will be a requirement to compensate passengers in certain ways. I mean, speaking purely personally, effectively this is a government-organised insurance scheme, and I'm not quite sure why avenues weren't chosen where passengers who wanted to have that reassurance weren't facilitated to make private insurance arrangements, and then those who don't particularly care don't have to do so, and you don't require a government agency to be involved. But nonetheless, the European Union has gone down this path and in fact is extending these rules now to other modes of transport. So I think those are pretty much permanent now. On the global emissions, I mean, speaking just as a simple economist and drawing on some of the discussions in other sessions, I'm sympathetic to the idea that if you had a carbon tax generally, all sectors, all activities, all countries, on the very simple principle that carbon is carbon, and whether it's issued by aircraft or anything else is essentially scientifically immaterial. You would then, as well as tackling the problem at source and tackling it on all sources, I think you might avoid some of the particular disputes you get when you're crafting a particular regime for a given industry. Now, specifically on your question, the pace of negotiation on that particular environmental charge for aviation has really been so slow that I can't see that too much will happen, in the short to medium term.
Mike, do you want to say something on that? On the point that was answered first, the global solution?
Well, from an airline point of view, when you've got different regulations in different countries, it gets really complicated. And if we go back, I'm an old guy, but 20 years ago, the U.S. put in computer reservation system rules, and then the European Commission did. And if you were in compliance with the European Commission, you were actually going to be in violation in the United States. And so this is why the airline industry places a lot of weight of we really need global solutions for this, and if we start to get different regimes developing, it really gets difficult, and compliance costs can be very expensive for the airlines. If we can work out a global solution on this, that would really be a positive step in reducing costs for the airlines and ultimately the consumer.
Okay, yeah, please.
General comment. I would certainly advocate for a efficiency target type of approach rather than an absolute cap, because when you start thinking about allocating caps, there's always a equity issue between the incumbents and the newcomers. So when you look at the efficiency or the intensity, fuel intensity, there's not much difference between a newly developed country airlines compared to the U.S. or European airlines. So that perhaps is the way that ICAO has been trying to address, and actually they have some sort of a resolution. But again, the issue is the absolute level of CO2, and we have to think about that too. But linking the regulation directly to the absolute level of emissions is not a feasible way from my perspective.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
One other comment I wanted to add is when I was at the Vancouver airport, when we started a new master plan process, which is typically 20 years, we actually thought it'd be important to actually think in a 40-year context. So we actually had we called it Forum 40, where we invited people to take a very long-term look. And one of the speakers or attendees we invited was Severin Suzuki Cullen. She's kind of the youth leader of the environmental movement. She became very famous at the Rio Summit. Golly, I think that's 10, 15 years ago right now. And she had a very interesting comment to make. So she's a very attractive 21-year-old. She says, I'm probably the only person in this room that's actually going to be using the airport 40 years from now. And but she made a very interesting comment. She said, when it comes to carbon, her generation and her movement embraces the concept that we have to reduce carbon. But she says that doesn't mean that every sector has to reduce carbon. And this ties in with a comment I think that Professor Sen made today. There's great social as well as economic value from transportation generally and air transportation in particular. And what she said is that my generation actually wishes to choose to fly, and we are willing to make sacrifices elsewhere. Maybe we won't have a single-family home in North America. We will go to a European, Asian type of apartment condominium type living. We want the ability to choose where we make our carbon reductions, and even if that means that aviation's carbon impact is going to increase. And of course, aviation is making great strides. We reduce our carbon content per passenger kilometer by in the range of 2% per year, and that seems to be increasing toward 2.5%. Unfortunately, the sector is growing between 4% and 5%, so the total carbon is growing.
Okay, Mike, thanks very much indeed. Yeah, question in the back there.
Ayman Ali from the African Development Bank. I have questions, actually several questions to Mr. Sani. I'll make them quick. The first one, I guess that the smoother relationship or cooperation between Turkish Airlines and TAV could have stemmed from the fact that you are both at a certain stage of, let's say, a national spirit of economic growth, where Turkish airports were targeting specifically Istanbul to become a national hub. International hub, and that was the same objective for Turkish Airways. How true is this, and how have you seen the cooperation between the airlines and the company getting affected as Turkish Airlines gets established itself more and more as an international carrier? The second question is on the PPP airports. What type of operations were these mainly? Were they on the operation side, or actually the construction of the airport? And what is the share of domestic traffic in this airport? And the reason for the question is the plans usually to develop a national hub at the main airport and the plans to engage PPP in other airports can sometimes cannibalize each other. And probably you know about the example of Enfida Airport in Tunisia, where it was the case between the main airport and Enfida. So yes, these are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I know that you financed Enfida and Monastir Airport. We are operating those airports. Thank you to African Development Bank. Now, you're right. I would like to start from the last question. In Tunisia, the Monastir Airport was the existing airport, and Enfida Airport is the one which we have built. And there is only 50 kilometers difference between these two airports. But after the revolution, Arab Spring, the nationalist issues, micronationalism started in Tunisia. I mean, Monastir people did not want to go to Enfida. There is only 50 kilometers between these two airports. But now it's calm. Everything is there. The transition period is done. So there is no problem in them. They understood that in aviation, there can't be, I mean, you cannot force passengers to go to that airport or that airport. It's finalized. This kind of cannibalization wasn't because of the wrong statements in PPP. It was just the revolution and post-revolution effects. Coming to Turkey, the Turkish Airlines relations, yes, you're right. When we started this business in 2000, Istanbul Airport was only an OND airport, origin and destination. I mean, we had departing passengers and we had arriving passengers. We do not have any transit passengers at all, any transfer passengers at all. But when Turkish Airlines started with the first Turkish Airlines was rejecting the liberalization, because they were state-owned and they were saying that they wouldn't like competition. But when our Mr. Minister opened the liberalization, Turkish Airlines grew a lot. I mean, they understood that, I mean, the afraiding of this competition was empty. I mean, so they grew a lot. And other Turkish Airlines, Pegasus, Atlas, Onur Air grew a lot as well. So everybody was starting to grow. And what we have done, we positioned ourselves accordingly. We understood that transit passengers will increase and Istanbul is going to be a national hub. So we extended the terminal building. In our PPP concession, we had an article saying that we could increase invest 30% more, and we get 30% extension. And then we increased our terminal building and made the new configuration according to the transit and transfer passengers. Now, actually, it's not even enough. It's a congested airport. Ministry of Transport made another tender, third airport tender, and it's going to be a third airport in Istanbul in the coming 5 or 6 years. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the tender, but I'm sure that that airport will be there. Turkish Airlines is really growing very well, but as an airport operator, if we cannot comply with their requirements, then the other day the problems will arise. So this airline and airport, which was the main actually topic in this panel, what is really the important issue in operating the airport. Concerning the PPPs, especially in emerging markets, governments are giving guarantees to make the finance easy in airport operations. In Istanbul, you don't need guarantee. But in Ankara, for example, we are operating Ankara Airport and Izmir Airport. What we have done, government give a guarantee, passenger guarantee. Actually, this guarantee means revenue guarantee from aeronautical side. So this is making the financing viable. Otherwise, you cannot finance the airports. With the guarantee of the passenger guarantee in Izmir and in Istanbul, in Ankara, we were able to go to PPPs. Again, it comes to that equation which I say. Because in Ankara, it was really hard to build an airport of that size, which is one of the best airports in Europe now. In ACI, it's selected the best airport in Europe. The architecture is great, and 200,000 square meter, 2 runways, very nice airport. But the passenger number is not as like as Istanbul. Concerning the domestic, in Ankara, domestic passenger is nearly 70%, and 30% is international passenger. That is why government gave us a guarantee in domestic and international passengers to make this equation work. Same applies to Izmir. For example, Izmir needed a new domestic terminal, but a domestic passenger fee or aeronautical fees are not enough, are not sufficient to build a very nice terminal there. So they made a tender for the concession of the international, extended and made the equation work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. I'll take these 2 questions here, and then we're going to have to wrap. The gentleman in the just on the end here.
Glyn Jones, Managing Director at Luton Airport in London. 2 questions, if I may, Axel. One to Mike and one to Sani. Mike, the work you've done on value distribution, I think, is absolutely fascinating. And although on a much smaller scale, pretty much reflects what we've done locally. But one question I'd be really interested to hear your view on is the way in which that value distribution is likely to change in the future with both national policy and supranational policy on consumer protection. The gentleman from, I think it was USA Today, talked about denied boarding compensation, delay compensation, regulation of queue lengths, etc., all attempting to increase value, either qualitative or quantitative, to the passenger, but all costing money, usually from either the airport or the airline. So that's the question to Mike. To Sani, thank you for making me feel totally inadequate. 10 times GDP growth in passenger numbers, a phenomenal performance. I absolutely agree with your contention that the best way to manage the inevitably entertaining relationship between airports and airlines is to grow the cake. Absolutely. But in the UK, we now have a long-term 40-year forecast of growth pretty much at the long-run GDP level. It's going to be pretty difficult to increase the cake a lot. And although you could go down a market share strategy route, plenty of people have gone bust doing that, so probably not all that wise. What's your view on trying to manage that relationship when there is no bigger cake?
Why don't we start with that, and then we'll come to Mike. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not to invest. There is only one solution. I mean, you're right. I mean, if the cake is not, there is no way to increase the cake, enlarge the cake, then the only way not to invest and just go for revenue and OPEX relation. That's it.
Okay, Mike.
I'm known for having some heretical ideas when it comes to airports, but earlier I made reference to the development of non-aeronautical revenues by airlines, and what we're seeing is a small but growing number of airlines are now offering insurance products. And essentially it's becoming a matter of choice for the passenger. Do you want to buy insurance around an interrupted trip, for example? If you do, you will pay more, and that actually becomes a source of revenue for the airline. The government solution seems to be one that we, the government, are going to decide what level of service the passenger needs. We will impose that then as a requirement across the board. And we're actually seeing, I'm really fascinated in the United States right now where they have two consumer rules already implemented, Consumer Rules 1 and 2. 2 dealt with transparency around baggage fees. And now they've got Consumer Rule 3 having to do with the way that ancillary fees are displayed in global distribution systems. But the market's actually already solving this, and it seems to me we might not actually need a government regulation in this. Just in the last few weeks, American Airlines is engaged in agreements with one of the major GDSs around this. I actually see these issues of consumer protection as an opportunity for consumers to choose what they want and choose not to have protection that they don't want, and it actually creates a revenue opportunity for the entire value chain, the airline as well as the insurance companies that are part of the value chain.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And let's, just a quick comment from,
perhaps UK and Japan is similar in terms of the maturity of the economy and the future of the growth level. And I guess it won't be a big cake, but there will be small biscuits to look, yeah. And hopefully the biscuits would be a large one. So a new brand or new sort of a breed of business trying to utilize the full capacity of the infrastructure might turn out to be a big cake in the end.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, let's take that final question there, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne Fry from the UK. I wanted to touch on another aspect of passenger rights, and that is the large and growing number of passengers who are older and have disabilities, and for whom passenger rights laws now exist in the US, which puts the responsibility on the airlines, in Europe, which puts it on the airports, in Canada. All around the world now there are rights which say that the disabled passenger should not pay for the assistance that they need, however expensive that assistance is. That in turn is generating quite a lot of conflict between airlines and airports about who is creating the problem that necessitates the assistance that is provided and who therefore should pay for it. And I was interested in the panel's views on where they stood on this in these difficult economic times.
Mike.
I was involved in the regulatory case in Canada. We called it the one person, one fare case. And there the regulatory agency did put down an order that, for example, a passenger who needs a traveling companion, the airline must provide that for the seat at no charge for the passenger. That's a matter of government policy. I understand why that decision was made. It did impose significant costs on the airlines, which they will simply have to absorb, but it's a matter of policy. In another case, which involved onboard oxygen, there the issue is a passenger may need oxygen. The traditional delivery method would be bottled oxygen on board the aircraft, and bottled oxygen is actually hazardous material. So the airline handling such a customer has to actually have a hazardous materials license. So in Canada, Air Canada had such a license, whereas WestJet, the low-cost carrier, chose not to handle any hazardous material. So they were actually relieved of the responsibility. But what was interesting on the airport interface is that these passengers often need oxygen in the airport itself. And the new technology of portable oxygen concentrators, actually for all but about 4% of passengers who need higher oxygen concentration, the portable oxygen concentrator, which is a device that's in their own control, actually ended up being a better solution because they can use their portable oxygen concentrator as they move through the airport, the original airport, the connecting airport, and the termination airport, as well as using it on board the aircraft. It completely eliminates the need for a hazardous materials license by the airline. I'm not sure if that was a sufficiently evasive answer or not, but
who do you think should ultimately, in this issue in general, I mean, and let's face it, it covers a number of other areas, who should bear the responsibility, the airport or the airline? Both. They should share it.
Yes.
And I guess one of the messages we've got out of this is a combined problem-solving, problem-sharing solution to a number of these issues. Good. All right. I'm going to give each of you, as I did this morning in my session, about 10, 15 seconds to do a summary wrap, the message, the forward-looking message you want our audience to take away with you. Let's start at the end here.
Okay, well, I think in terms of airline-airport relations, I would just add one thing to what's been said already. I think by tradition, airports have been dealing with a single class of airline. I mean, if you go back 20 years. And they've been accustomed to offering a single service to the industry. But in the world we're in now, if you continue to do that when you have a diverse group of airlines, there'll be more conflict than otherwise. And I think the lesson is both diversification of the service by airports as far as possible and the associated diversification of charges will provide some basis for smoother relations.
Stanley.
Aviation is a complex business and a volume business. The only way to solve the problems is the constructive negotiations, being flexible, and sense of urgency and quick decisions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike?
My closing comments would be, first of all, that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Different airports and different regimes and different legal regimes all have their challenges, and so we don't want one-size-fits-all, and we need a regulatory regime that has greater flexibility for the relationship between the airline and the airport. Some regulatory regimes actually are an impediment to a more efficient pricing and relationship between the airline and airport.
Okay, and finally, that's you.
I guess airports have woken up to become very strategic worldwide. So you know, we need to seek for new relationship between the airlines and the airports, and perhaps we have to build more best practices and share them so that we learn more about this a new relationship.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to the whole panel for their insights and the anecdotes that they've shared with us. It's been a fascinating discussion, and thank you for the paper as well, which we, of course, used as a context. And my thanks to you for being here this afternoon and for your questions. Thanks very much indeed.